Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, and then there were none. We've all read an Agatha Christie novel or watched a TV adaptation. There's been a few over the years.
I think she's probably one of the most prolific novelists the country's ever produced.
The only other books that have sold more than hers are Shakespeare's and the Bible.
She created a genre, really, of crime writing that's still around, and people just love it.
It is not always that simple.
In each tantalizing mystery, Agatha's much-loved characters, Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, have astonished us with their powers of deduction.
Oh, yes. The little grey cells have done well today.
But how did a short Belgian and a little old lady become two of the most famous detectives in the world?
Nobody is beyond suspicion.
It is impossible to conceal anything from Hercule Poirot.
And how on earth did Agatha Christie come up with each outrageously compelling plot?
She's the queen of crime, and her plotting is absolutely fantastic.
She takes you by the hand, she leads you into the maze, somehow she brings you out the other side. You're not exactly sure where you've been, but you know you've enjoyed the journey.
Now, 100 years after the first Agatha Christie novel was published, and as a new Hollywood version of Death on the Nile is released, we look back over a century at 10 of Agatha's greatest works. With access to the family archive,
I always think of two Agatha Christies. There is Agatha Christie, the kind of global figure, and then there is what we in our family referred to as Nima. She was a lovely, warm, kind person.
we hear from the great lady herself.
You see, I put it all down to the fact that I never had any education.
And reveal the life and secrets of an author who has entertained millions.
You start believing one set of things to be true, and then she'll take you on a very windy path. And at the very end, there'll nearly always be a reveal that you simply had never expected.
This is a celebration of a century of Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie is the world's most influential crime writer. From the classic drawing room, it was him scene, to the clueless sidekick and detective. Red herrings and murder abound, against a backdrop of unassuming quaint charm.
Was there much blood?
She kind of paved the way for everything that's happened since with regards to crime storytelling in theatre and television and film, I think.
You know, there are shows, whether it's Death in Paradise or Vera,
Midsummer Murders,
Jonathan Creek.
Line of Duty.
We see her debt absolutely everywhere.
But her extraordinary impact on the world wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for her first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Published 100 years ago, it's the tale of a dastardly murder in an English country house. Exactly a century ago, a mysterious, unsolicited package arrived in Vigo Street in central London. Inside was a manuscript for a novel that would mark the beginning of a phenomena that would go on to enthrall billions of people around the world. This was the first novel by Agatha Christie. 4 years earlier, in 1916, the First World War had been raging in Europe. 26-year-old Agatha Christie had recently married husband Archie, and he had gone to fight with the Royal Flying Corps abroad. At home in Torquay, Agatha joined the war effort, working with the nursing corps at a local hospital. To pass the time, she would often write stories. In 2008, the Christie family discovered unheard recordings of Agatha. This archive offers us a fascinating insight.
People often ask me what made me take up writing. You see, I put it all down to the fact that I never had any education. But I found myself making up stories and acting in different parts, and there's nothing like boredom to make you write.
But one evening, whilst reading detective stories with her sister Madge, a challenge was set.
Agatha's sister made a bet with her that she couldn't write or certainly couldn't get published a novel.
Agatha took the bet seriously.
I'd finished the first book of mine ever to be published, The Mysterious Affair at Styles.
Agatha could never have dreamt of how successful she would become. And in particular, in this first story, with the creation of the most prolific detective of all time. He was the enigmatic Belgian with a fastidious dress sense and a head full of little grey cells.
The Scarlet Pimpernel. It is believed that when this flower is open, it is a sign of a prolonged spell of the fine weather. It is seldom seen open in this country.
There were a lot of Belgian refugees in Torquay at the time of the First World War, and that somewhere, somehow, she either saw something or someone that put, as it were, the visual clue into her head.
Hercule Poirot appears in 33 novels, 3 plays, and more than 50 short stories. Yet his first appearance in The Mysterious Affair at Styles is not particularly complimentary.
Poirot was an extraordinary-looking little man. He was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched it a little on one side. His moustache was very stiff and military. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound.
And his appearance wasn't the only unfortunate thing about him. This very unconventional hero had some unexpected traits.
Effete.
Meticulous.
Arrogant.
Curious.
Sexless.
Infuriating.
Tricky.
As well as a deeply ironic name.
Hercule is Agatha Christie's joke, that I remember. She took a little man with a bald head and a strange moustache, an effete foreigner, and gave him the most masculine of names, based on, of course, Hercules.
He's not a fully rounded character. We don't know a lot about his past. We don't know a lot about his feelings and his thoughts, but that is sort of the point. His function in the book is to be a kind of extended brain. It is his brain that matters.
Not only did Agatha introduce us to a curious and instantly memorable detective, but she established a genre that has survived a century. That of murder and betrayal in sleepy English villages. It's 100 years since the publication of Agatha Christie's groundbreaking first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, the book that first introduced us to Hercule Poirot. It is set in 1916, during the middle of the First World War. Lieutenant Hastings, an army officer, has been injured fighting on the Western Front. He's invited to spend his sick leave at the beautiful manor house Styles Court by an old friend, John Cavendish.
Hastings is staying at Styles, a very beautiful mansion, a very nice long driveway.
It really does tick a lot of the boxes that we might expect from Agatha Christie. She's good enough to supply us with a floor plan, which means that we really have to think about the novel as a puzzle.
But all is not well at Styles. John's stepmother, Emily Inglethorpe, has recently found a new, somewhat younger husband.
Mr. Hastings, my husband.
I'm delighted to meet you, Lieutenant Hastings.
And the rest of the family are suspicious of his motives.
Watch that devil.
The characters we see in Styles are probably the type of characters who lots of people think are the archetypal Christie sort of list of suspects and victims, because we have upper middle class or upper class people here. But there are also people who are very interested in things like hereditary wealth and how this is going to work for them. So lots of people who might have a good reason to perhaps change the family tree in a particular way.
As she was writing her novel, Agatha was moved from general nursing work to the more specialized pharmacy, where she began to learn about poisons. This would go on to feature as the murder weapon in many of her stories, and Styles was no exception. When Mrs. Inglethorpe is found poisoned, Agatha uses her specialist knowledge to cleverly develop the mystery.
She has really thought through the way that a particular suspect might be able to administer a fatal dose of this poison.
Hastings, being there, suggests calling in an old friend of his whom he knows to be in the vicinity, who, wow, happens to be the greatest detective on earth. That's handy.
The Mysterious Affair at Styles was also the moment when Poirot acquired his sidekick.
Hastings?
Monsieur Poirot!
It is indeed.
I played the role of Captain Hastings in the television series Agatha Christie's Poirot. I got a call from my agent, and then they asked me to go back subsequently to read with David Suchet, and we read a couple of scenes, which seemed to go quite well, and they asked me to play the part. You know, they are completely opposite characters. Hastings is much more worldly than Poirot. Poirot is supremely intelligent and analytic and incredibly tidy and meticulous about everything. Hastings is quite the opposite.
You say to me that Madame Inglethorpe ate very little for supper.
Yes.
One of those curious little facts, mon ami. We put it here.
The detective needs two things. He needs somebody he can talk to, so that he can explain what his thought processes are. But also the author needs that sidekick to misdirect the audience.
We are possibly half a step ahead of Hastings, because he'll say something like, if you cannot see in this room what I see, my dear friend Hastings, then you are even more of an imbecile than I thought. And of course we are then tantalised by that. What is it he can see that Hastings can't see? We flatter ourselves we're cleverer than Hastings, but we still can't quite see it.
Over the years, the eccentric Belgian detective has appeared in dozens of feature films, with many great actors taking the role, including Peter Ustinov, Albert Finney, and Kenneth Branagh. But it took over 70 years for Poirot to make it onto the small screen, and getting the very first adaptation off the ground was no mean feat.
So my mum, who was TV producer Pat Sands, and she had persuaded the estate to allow her, my mum, to put Agatha on the small screen, because Agatha in her lifetime had said, I'm films or nothing. And Mum always described it as going to the board, the Christie board, and giving a sort of an oral examination of her immense knowledge of Agatha Christie.
ITV's Poirot series was first broadcast in 1989 and went on to run for a staggering 70 episodes. Actor David Suchet played Poirot in every one of them, and for many, he has defined the role.
It's almost like something weirdly magic is going on, because he seems to me just to actually be the perfect embodiment of Poirot.
Whenever I read Agatha Christie now and read a Poirot, I'm afraid I see David.
David Suchet's approach to the role has become the stuff of TV legend.
He wore a fat suit, and so he had this custom-made kind of wooden thing where he just sort of lean into it, and so in between takes he'd just sort of sit there in this thing and lean and have his cup of tea and stuff.
It's well known that he remains in character a lot of the time.
I don't think I ever spoke to him on the set as himself. He was the character. When he was having lunch, he was the character.
There was a kind of moment of truth when we did Death in the Clouds, some of which was filmed in Paris. There was a big French crew as well as some English. And David came out and said, bonjour, bonjour mes amis. And the first assistant came over and said, bonjour David, and then started speaking French in a really fast Parisian way. And of course David didn't get it because he doesn't speak French that quite as well as you think he does.
The introduction of Poirot and his relationship with Hastings were not the only seminal aspects of the mysterious affair at Styles. There was one other groundbreaking element that, like the book itself, almost didn't happen. It was actually suggested by the publishers.
Mesdames et messieurs, good evening.
Originally, Christie had written the ending of Mysterious Affair at Styles to take place in a courtroom. At the suggestion of her publisher, she went back and rewrote it to be a more of a, what we could think of as a drawing room conclusion.
Agatha Christie invented this summing up where Poirot gathers people together at the end and you know that the criminal is in the room.
Poirot goes round and says, it could have been you, 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 and you keep on waiting for the blow to fall.
And yet, Madame Inglethorpe ordered a fire to be lighted in her room. Why?
Because she wanted to burn something.
Précisément, Inspector Japp.
It's not something that Scotland Yard detective would do, but he had to put up with it because that was his way of doing things.
And that became obviously a staple of the genre and obviously of her own work.
Agatha's drawing room conclusion was impressively inventive. Not only was it adopted by numerous crime writers, but it's also in the vast majority of murderous television dramas, like Death in Paradise. Following the success of her first novel, Agatha Christie wrote 4 more books. By 1926, she was considered a successful novelist. She and her husband Archie moved into a brand new house in Sunningdale, Berkshire, that they had called Styles, and they had a daughter, Rosalind. It was the publication of her next novel that established Agatha as not only a popular author, but also one who could redefine the genre. It tells the tale of another scandalous murder in a sleepy English village. But this one is a murder with a twist. The murder of Roger Ackroyd is significant because it's Christie's most daring crime mystery, and its twist fundamentally changed detective fiction forever.
It does something really audacious and unexpected.
It is still one of the most extraordinary twists in detective fiction. That was the book that really set her up. That was the book that made her name.
I cannot say what it is about the murder of Roger Ackroyd that makes this book unique. That is the problem here.
The story is set in the quintessential English village of King's Abbot.
You've got the 2 big country houses. One is Roger Ackroyd's, one belongs to a lady called Mrs. Ferrers, and they've been having a bit of a thing. And then it turns out that Mrs. Ferrers has killed herself. And then it turns out Mrs. Ferrers has killed herself because someone was blackmailing her.
I will kill you!
Another resident of King's Abbot turns out to be none other than the famous detective Hercule Poirot, retired and without his sidekick Hastings.
I think Christie realised pretty soon that actually she was quite encumbered by Hastings. So she was quite happy to marry him off and send him to the Argentine.
The murder of Roger Ackroyd is narrated in the first person by Poirot's neighbour, Dr. Shepherd.
Not Shepherd.
Dr. Shepherd, in the book, plays the Hastings role. He accompanies Poirot. He knows a certain amount of what Poirot's thinking.
The friendship between Poirot and Dr. Shepherd, who is so desperate to help him solve the crime, is a really interesting one, particularly in the light of what happens.
And you've also got Shepherd's sister, Caroline.
I saw something quite peculiar just now.
She knows everything that's going on in this village.
He was talking to a girl.
And if she doesn't know it, she's jolly well going to find out.
No, the fewer people disturb this room, the better.
The incredible twist at the end of the book was suggested to Agatha by 2 very different people, her sister Madge's husband and a member of the royal family, no less.
The murder of Roger Ackroyd has been a very decided success, partly because of having found an original twist for a detective story slot. This, which I must say, I owe mostly to my brother-in-law's chance remark. As a matter of fact, the same idea, though in a different form, was suggested to me by no less a person, Lord Louis Mountbatten.
The secret of Roger Ackroyd is in pretty much every sentence of the book. And I read it a second time simply to see if there was a single sentence that was fake or which lied to me. And I can tell you there isn't.
I think it's a brilliant book to reread because to see how she has placed those clues, it's just exquisite.
Adapting the book for television
Are you all right, Chief Inspector?
was not a challenge for the faint-hearted.
I've adapted many Agatha Christie short stories and novels, and they each had different challenges. Actually, when you deconstructed them, trying to reconstruct them again and nail them to the screen, as it were, was often quite difficult.
With this book, it was impossible to tell the story the way Agatha had intended.
The TV adaptation with David Suchet famously really didn't use the plot twist and kind of actually operated in a more traditional linear manner.
The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was published by Collins in 1926 to great acclaim. But the book's central twist was to be mirrored by an equally sensational twist in the life of Agatha Christie. In 1926, Agatha Christie published The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. The book was hailed as a triumph and propelled her to superstardom. But her personal life started to fall apart.
It's always seemed odd to me that Murder of Roger Ackroyd comes out this great triumph in 1926 because that was the year her life went so spectacularly wrong.
Just after the publication of Roger Ackroyd, Agatha's mother died.
She absolutely worshipped her mother, Clara, this little woman but with such a force. She was a perfect mother, really.
While Agatha was clearing the family house of her mother's belongings, her husband Archie turned up with devastating news. He wanted a divorce. The sense of betrayal was like a scene from one of her own novels.
Archie met someone else, and things just, fell to pieces.
Must have been desperately low. And so, Archie couldn't have chosen a worse moment.
This was the beginning of an extraordinary series of events in her personal life that would develop into one of the most enduring real-life mystery stories of the 20th century. On the 3rd of December 1926, the then 36-year-old Agatha left her home in Sunningdale, said goodbye to her sleeping daughter, and then drove off into the night. The next morning, the vehicle was found abandoned on a hillside close to the Silent Pool in Sheer, Surrey. Inside was a fur coat and a driving license. Of Agatha Christie, there was no sign.
The media reaction to this was extraordinary. In some ways, this catapulted her to another level of fame. It was a massive story. Thousands of people went round the country searching for her. Lakes were dredged, all those kind of things.
After 11 days, Agatha turned up at a hotel in Harrogate. She refused to speak about the incident and was put off doing publicity for the rest of her life.
Now, exactly what happened between her leaving Sunningdale and turning up in Harrogate, no one knows. It's actually a bigger mystery than any of her books. Throughout my life, I've always hoped that there is an envelope that will be passed down through the family and that one day I will get it. I suspect there isn't, but I guess my father may have it still, and I may get it one time, or my sisters may get it. I don't know.
The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is widely held to be the greatest crime novel of all time. But Agatha was tiring of Poirot. She began to look for a new hero and was inspired by one of the characters she had created in Roger Ackroyd.
Why, Hercule?
Madame Shepherd.
Isn't it terrible about poor Parker?
The character of Caroline Shepherd was one of the inspirations behind Agatha's new literary detective, and she first appeared in our next novel. It's one of Agatha's most well-known stories and tells a tale of murder most foul in another quiet English village.
One thing I love about the novel, her enjoyment of the story she's telling leaps off every page.
Agatha Christie's new detective was none other than an elderly spinster, Miss Marple.
Nosy.
Suspicious.
Sceptical.
Inquisitive.
Self-effacing.
Just granny-like.
Fluffy on the outside.
Machiavellian.
This brilliant, brilliant concept of the little old lady who's got a better brain than the head of Scotland Yard.
I just had the idea, an old spinster lady living in a village, the sort of old lady who would have been rather like some of my grandmother's cronies.
After her life had gone so spectacularly wrong, I think possibly it was a comfort to recreate the women of her childhood.
But she had this in common with my grandmother, that although a completely cheerful person, she always expected the worst of anyone and everything, and was with almost frightening accuracy usually proved right.
Nothing goes past you, Miss Marple, does it?
Hardly ever.
She obviously was slightly nosy, perhaps a little like Agatha. You know, she noticed what went on around her. She's constantly popping up from pruning her roses to notice whoever it is walking past.
She has no life experience. She's never been married. She's never had children. She's never experienced intense emotions of the kind that lead one to commit murder. But she can recognise them.
The book is set in the quaint English village of St Mary Mead.
She never lived in a village, Agatha, not like St Mary Mead, but she knew that life. The details are very, very good.
There is one resident the villagers despise. Colonel Prothero.
I expect to see a full set of parish accounts, or I'm going to take this matter further. Yes? Is that quite clear?
Everybody loathes him. He's making enemies left, right and centre, so he's kind of got an arrow saying victim pointing to his head. And then, oh, hello, in the village there's this kind of glamorous young man painting everybody.
I forgot you were coming.
The usual stuff going on there.
Is he doing Mrs. Prothero too?
You've also got this beautiful kind of chorus transposed to the English home counties of the old ladies. Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Weatherby, whatever, they were completely in charge. The vicar's terrified of them.
The colonel is discovered in his study, shot in the head.
There are some really obvious suspects. In fact, a couple of people who step forward and say, actually, I did this.
A very bold piece of misdirection as to the culprit, but it comes down to a beautiful simplicity in the end.
Miss Marple first appeared on screen 32 years after Murder at the Vicarage was first published. She was played by Margaret Rutherford and Angela Lansbury on the big screen. Then in 1984, the BBC adapted all the original Miss Marple stories, starring Joan Hickson.
Joan Hickson, who I thought was wonderful. Joan wasn't a big enough name to be in the films, but she did have a letter from Agatha Christie saying, "You are my perfect idea of Marple."
Oh, look very shocked, Vicar. Come sit down.
I remember watching Joan Hickson thinking, she is so good.
In the 21st century, ITV brought back Miss Marple, first of all with Geraldine McEwan and then with Julia Mackenzie. Geraldine McEwan's is much more broad. Julia Mackenzie goes back to that sort of original idea that actually she sits around in the background and really observes and doesn't draw attention to herself.
Miss Marple was an instant hit with the public, both in the adaptations and in the original novel. The post-World War I public were comforted by this unconventional, matriarchal detective. By 1928, Agatha and Archie's divorce was finalised. She was allowed to keep his surname, but after the scandal of her disappearance, she was constantly hounded by the press. Agatha left England and headed east to Baghdad.
She heard about, that part of the world and decided that she'd like to go there. I think this sums up her kind of adventurous spirit. It's hard to imagine now, but I think you should, is that how brave she must have been at a time when a woman travelling that far, on her own would have been very rare.
In Iraq, Agatha discovered a love of archaeology. She returned to Iraq for a second time, and that's when she met a dashing young archaeologist called Max Mallowan. They fell in love, and as soon as they got back to England, they were married. Throughout her travels, Agatha continued to write. One book in particular was influenced by her trips to Baghdad. It was full of glamour and intrigue, and it would go on to inspire 2 blockbuster Hollywood movies. Because instead of traveling by steamship, Agatha decided to take the train. Agatha Christie's most celebrated work was published in 1934. It's set on the exotic Orient Express, the train that Agatha took that connects east to west.
It is the summit of her genius in many respects. Again, so hard to discuss it without mentioning the solution.
It has a claim to being Christie's masterpiece. The solution is one of the cleverest, if not the cleverest, in the whole of mystery fiction.
Hercule Poirot is called back from Istanbul to England and has to take a train. He manages to get a second-class ticket on board the famous Orient Express.
The Calais coach on the train is full of an eclectic bunch of characters, from princesses to travelling salesmen.
Where he meets an American called Mr. Ratchet, who asks him for his protection.
He's been getting death threats. And Poirot turns him down. He says, "I don't like your face." And then Ratchet's murdered. Stabbed. Multiple stab wounds.
The plot is based on a true story. In 1932, famous aviator Charles Lindbergh's son was kidnapped and then murdered.
Tragic story that Agatha Christie had most certainly read. And there was also the case that she found herself on a train that, due to rain, not snow, was caused to stop for a great deal of time. So she put those two together to create this masterpiece.
The weather has stopped the train. No one can escape. There's very much a sense of that claustrophobia.
In the book, Agatha cleverly traps her cast of characters in the enclosed environment of a train carriage.
The detective Hercule Poirot believes that the murderer is still on the train with us.
It becomes apparent that no single one of the passengers can possibly have done it because everyone is alibied by at least one other person.
Throughout the story, the reader is teased by the terrible kidnap and murder that happened a couple of years before.
This is a complex case that actually is not as straightforward as somebody killing just for perhaps financial gain.
And then Poirot unveils this amazing solution that is the only one that makes it all possible, and yet we just did not see it and never would have seen it in a million years.
The solution sees Poirot facing an interesting dilemma, as the recently murdered Mr. Ratchet was a very unpleasant man.
He deserved to be executed for what he did, and the world knows it was a travesty that he was not!
How far do human beings have the right to bring about justice if legal justice has let them down? Which is a really, really big question. And the whole book turns on that idea.
He puts forward two possible solutions to the crime. One is an anonymous killer who comes and goes in the night, and the other is the real killer. And he allows the police officer to decide which version he is going to use. So the real killer actually goes free.
Murder on the Orient Express has been made into two big-budget feature films. The most recent of these was directed by Kenneth Branagh in 2015. He also starred as none other than Hercule Poirot.
From the minute I saw Kenneth Branagh being Poirot, I believed in him as Poirot.
Physically, a lot of people were surprised by the moustache, but also I think that people think Poirot as being a bit sort of perhaps shorter and stouter than Kenneth Branagh actually is. But he showed that you can really rethink and reinvent the character in different ways.
But back in 1974, director Sidney Lumet was the first to persuade the greatest actors of the day to jump aboard his epic production.
I think Sidney Lumet did us a huge favour with Murder on the Orient Express. He kind of set up that genre of the all-star murder mystery.
Sidney Lumet's first major signing was Sean Connery.
And as soon as he got Sean Connery, then everybody else kind of said yes and came.
Albert Finney's one and only portrayal of Poirot was thought to be closest to Agatha's version, clever, egotistical and vain.
My first ever experience of watching a Poirot in anything was Albert Finney in Murder on the Orient Express. And I remember loving that movie, absolutely loving it.
I think Albert Finney's Poirot was more sort of robust. He was bigger, he was louder.
This was the only big screen adaptation Agatha Christie saw when she made one of her last public appearances at the premiere in 1974.
She did indicate that she was generally happy with Albert Finney.
But Agatha was far from finished with either her hero or exotic locations. And her next novel, as celebrated as The Orient Express, also took Hollywood by storm. Despite her huge success as a crime novelist, Agatha Christie continued to travel the world. It was even claimed she became the first Western woman to stand up on a surfboard. Back on dry land, Agatha was a regular feature on her second husband, Max Mallowan's archaeological digs.
Archaeology is something that pops up time and time again. She felt particularly happy on archaeological digs.
It was on a trip to Egypt that she was inspired to write another Poirot story. It was a tale of obsession and crimes of passion, set against the stunning backdrop of the land of the pharaohs. Death on the Nile is one of Agatha's shortest books, but the exotic setting and well-drawn characters make it one of her most famous.
Death on the Nile was probably the first Agatha Christie I ever read.
I love Death on the Nile because I grew up with Death on the Nile.
This is as good as it gets in terms of detective fiction.
Death on the Nile tells the story of wealthy American socialite Lynette Doyle, who steals and marries her best friend's lover. They then go on honeymoon to Egypt.
But they are joined by the young man's ex, who is obsessed with him.
Lynette! What a simply divine surprise. We just can't stop bumping into each other, can we? Hello, Simon.
But there's something really, the beating heart of that story, the love triangle, that story of betrayal and what you'll do for love is really powerful.
This is another of Agatha's closed mysteries. This time, she traps her characters on a seemingly tranquil cruise down the Nile.
In the course of this cruise, there is an altercation.
Mr. Belfort! Shoot you like a dog, like the dirty dog you are!
She shoots him in the leg, and while everybody is crowding round and a fuss is being made about this event,
Lynette cops it.
Fortunately, one of the fellow passengers is none other than Hercule Poirot.
There are a lot of people who've got motives for Lynette, so it's a classic in that way. But the solution does something different and inventive.
Death on the Nile was first adapted for the big screen in 1978. Peter Ustinov made the first of 6 big screen appearances as Poirot. His portrayal was thought to be more light-hearted and bumbling.
I love the Peter Ustinov Poirot. It's maybe a bit left field, but I absolutely adore him as Poirot.
The Ustinov Poirot is much more sort of gentle. It's somebody who'd much rather have at a dinner party. You can see a lot of Peter Ustinov in this sort of, as a famous raconteur, you can see a lot of that in his version of Poirot.
Like Murder on the Orient Express, this film attracted an all-star cast.
It's cast to the hilt. Well, we'll get Maggie Smith, we'll throw her in, we'll get Bette Davis. So you again got that very stellar quality to the whole thing.
In 2020, Kenneth Branagh reprised his role as Poirot in another lavish, star-studded production.
We're incredibly excited about the new feature film version of Death on the Nile. So we worked closely with Michael Green, who adapted the book and also wrote Murder on the Orient Express. And Michael is fantastic at taking the story, actually not changing it very much, but making it feel really relevant to today.
We have an extraordinary cast. I mean, obviously you have Ken Branagh as Poirot himself, but then you've got Gal Gadot, you've got Armie Hammer, you've got Emma Mackey, you've got all sorts of stars, you've got Annette Bening, and the cast is younger, and that leads to a different atmosphere. I think fans will enjoy it a lot.
As the 1930s drew to a close, war clouds were once again building over Europe. Agatha, Max, and Rosalind were living in fashionable Kensington, London. Agatha continued to write. Whenever she could, she would escape to her childhood home of Ashfield in Torquay, Devon. It was a place that held fond memories.
And much of her childhood was spent, you know, sort of like around Anstey's Cove and Meadfoot Beach, doing all the things that children would enjoy doing.
Her childhood was probably the happiest time of her life.
Agatha's siblings were much older than her, so she spent most of her early life alone with her mother.
Mother had quite strong Christian Science beliefs for a while, and one of her very strong instructions was that Agatha must not be taught to read.
She lived in her imagination and she created worlds and games for herself. She also famously didn't attend school, and her mother didn't want her to read until she was 7 or 8, but she secretly taught herself to read and then kind of, I think, spent most of her time self-educating.
I never had any education. Apart from being taught a little arithmetic, I'd had no lessons to speak of at all. But I found myself making up stories and acting the different parts.
Her childhood in Ashfield had laid the foundations for her career as a novelist. As an adult, Devon continued to spark her imagination, particularly a hotel she would often visit further along the coast.
It, in reality, is actually accessible. At low tide, you can walk across the beach, but then at high tide, it gets cut off.
This is Burr Island, and it was to be the inspiration for the most successful mystery story of all time. It's a dark psychological thriller set on an island from which there's no escape.
I mean, if I was going to put my list of 3 greatest murder mysteries ever written, I think we should almost certainly be on it.
It's a absolutely kind of irresistible formula. It doesn't feature Poirot, it doesn't feature Miss Marple, but it came out of her mind.
I wrote the book because it was so enormously difficult to do. The idea fascinating, and it is a very difficult technical accomplishment. I wrote the book, and I was pleased with what I had made of it. It was clear, straightforward, quite baffling, yet had a perfectly sound and reasonable explanation.
And Then There Were None is another Christie closed mystery. It's 1939, and Europe teeters on the brink of war. 10 strangers are invited to Soldier Island, an isolated rock on the Devon coast.
A group of people who do not know each other have all been invited for a sort of a weekend party by a man called U.N. Owen.
You are charged with the following indictments.
And on the first night, a phonograph is played.
That you murdered Louisa Mary Stevens.
And a voice accuses them all of having committed a murder.
They've all killed somebody. So this is payback.
One by one, the guests are murdered.
With no Poirot and no Marple to help them, the guests try to work out who the killer is.
He's dead. It's this brilliant, brilliant unravelling.
What does seem to be clear is that there's no one else on the island, so surely the murderer must be one of these 10 people.
There is no getting away. There is no little boat. That's mysteriously disappeared, so they can't make a getaway to the mainland.
They're killed off one by one, according to the nursery rhyme that's hung on the walls of all the bedrooms of these poor souls.
This was another first for Agatha, the use of childish innocence in a dark and sinister way. This is a trope that's been used in countless Hollywood blockbusters, from The Shining to The Exorcist.
It's like a doll in a horror film or something.
Takes the absolute innocence, the childlike innocence of the nursery rhyme, and utterly subverts it to the cause of murder. Say you get 1, 2, buckle my shoe, 5 little pigs, the mousetrap, and then there were none.
7 little soldiers chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in half, and then there were 6.
Then There Were None has been adapted more than any other Christie story. In 2015, Mammoth Screen and the Agatha Christie estate teamed up to produce a huge-scale production for the BBC to celebrate the 125th anniversary of Agatha's birth.
It was an amazing project to start with. It's been so influential. So many slasher films have been, you wouldn't have any number of Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, I think, without And Then There Were None. It's her bleakest book, kind of brilliantly bleak. It doesn't pull any punches, and it's just a real tour de force.
Agatha Christie was this kind of unassuming, as you see, middle-class lady. She knew extensively about murder, and you have to wonder how and why. I think she was a dark horse.
By 1938, Agatha Christie was a hugely successful author. She sold her childhood home of Ashfield and bought a new property in Devon called Greenway.
And she looked at it from the river one day and really did declare it the loveliest place in the world. It's somewhere where she could very much be Mrs. Mallowan as well as Agatha Christie, so without being known as that famous author.
I mean, it's just magical, an enchanted place. But it was also a place where she could just withdraw from the world.
But her idyllic life at Greenway was about to come to a jarring halt. The Second World War began, and the house was requisitioned by the American Navy. Agatha braved the bombing out in London.
Pretty much no part of London was untouched by bombs. You must have felt the fear. It must have been a very strange existence.
Despite the constant air raids, Agatha continued to write.
I never found any difficulty in writing during the war. I had written 2 books during the first years. This was in anticipation of my being killed in the raids, which seemed to me in the highest degree likely.
Then in 1942, she published an Hercule Poirot novel that was very different and ingeniously clever. The murder itself happened in the distant past.
Of all Agatha Christie's books, I think it is fair to say that Five Little Pigs has by far the most memorable murder.
Very few Christie novels have that kind of tunnel vision, focused, constrained structure. So that, you know, even aside from everything else it does, that makes it a quite unique Christie novel.
Although Five Little Pigs was her 25th Poirot story, it was not a conventional Christie. The murder took place 16 years earlier. So how would the famous detective find his clues? The murder in question was that of artist Amyas Crail, whose wife Caroline Crail was convicted of his murder. She protested her innocence, but then died in prison.
The daughter, Carla, goes to Hercule Poirot and says, I don't think my mother did it.
And my mother was Caroline.
The plot is cleverly constructed from a series of 5 interviews with the prime suspects in the case, dubbed the Five Little Pigs.
And of course, they all have something slightly different to say. 5 very well-drawn characters.
When she wrote the book, Agatha was again doing war work at the pharmacy at University College Hospital.
Elsa, you should have a sniff.
So her choice of murder weapon, the poison quinine, is no coincidence.
I've never heard of this.
It's distilled from the flowers of the spotted hemlock.
Agatha was writing about what she knew. Not only professionally, but also personally. The location of the story is unmistakable.
She has a murder at what they call the Battery, and that's where he dies. And she describes, you know it from the surround, the way she describes the river and all that kind of thing.
The setting was her own home, Greenway. Christie peppers the story with red herrings and clues.
And Amyas Crail, almost his last words are, as he drinks his beer, everything tastes foul today, he says.
Everything tastes foul today.
And we assume that he's talking about one thing, but actually he's talking about another. And that's one of the tricks in the book that make it such a pleasure.
Bloody rheumatism.
Then the bell sounded for lunch and Meredith came to fetch me. So we left him. To die alone.
It is a brilliant piece of construction, the way the 5 different versions of events come together and Poirot works out from what was said and what was seen, and particularly what was on the look on the artist's face just before he died.
Five Little Pigs was published in 1942. 2 years later, and Europe was at peace again. But the England of the late 1940s was a very different place. Values were changing, and this was reflected in a Miss Marple story published in 1950. It's a slightly comical look at a changing country. Yet it tells the story of an incredibly audacious murder. A Murder is Announced is a Miss Marple story, but this time it's not based in St Mary Mead. This novel is based in the village of Chipping Cleghorn.
So what I love about A Murder is Announced is that it's set in a sleepy post-war village with all these very kind of charming village types.
So A Murder is Announced starts with an advert in the local paper saying there will be a murder in this house at this time in this village.
There's going to be a murder.
What time?
7 o'clock this evening.
Short notice.
So the reader immediately sees all these villagers reading the local paper and going, oh, look, it says there's going to be a murder at Little Paddocks.
Listen to this! In the Gazette. A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October the 5th at Little Paddocks at 7 p.m.
Then it cuts to the owner of Little Paddocks, who reacts in much the same way. Oh, look, it says there's going to be a murder here at my house.
Yes, I better go and see if there's any sherry in the house.
Everybody is terribly interested by this, and so finds any excuse that they can to turn up to see what's going to actually happen. Is there going to be a game?
Well, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Evening. Good evening, Miss Blackmore.
Good evening.
This is jolly nice, isn't it?
Here we are.
Indeed, we are.
I just popped in to see whether you might be interested in a kitten. A kitten.
To pretend they've got another reason to turn up. How are your hens laying? How's this? How's that? And then somebody turns up and says, oh, am I too late for the murder?
Hello, Miss Blacklock. I'm not too late, am I? When does the murder begin?
It's nicely done. It's amusingly done, because that is actually just what would happen. And it starts like a game, like Murder in the Dark.
It's beginning! Archie!
At the appointed time, the lights go out.
Stick up, I tell you!
Isn't it wonderful?
I must say it's quite impressive so far.
And someone is found murdered, but not necessarily the person you would expect.
Good God. What is it? The man's dead.
You have to start to wonder who has manipulated this scenario, and surely somebody who turned up to Little Paddocks that evening must be our killer.
Conveniently, Miss Marple happens to be staying at the local hotel, and she joins the investigation.
She knows these people. She knows this setup.
You know, Inspector, some of the best murderers are women, especially in an English village. You turn over a stone, you have no idea what will crawl out.
The story weaves its way through a maze of double identity and trademark Christie red herrings.
It's a great detective story. I think it's one of the great detective stories in terms of the plotting.
Every single crucial clue is absolutely there for you to see, and you do see it, but you don't work it out.
As with most of Agatha's novels, the setting of A Murder is Announced is a reflection of British life at the time she was writing.
It is a really interesting portrayal of post-Second World War Britain, some of the hardships, the rationing that was going on, and people who maybe before the war had a certain style and standard of living, and suddenly things aren't as easy.
It's a world of rationing and coupons and immigrants from Europe.
All the old hierarchies are sort of falling apart a bit. They know a way of life and they're desperately trying to keep it up, and it's getting more and more difficult. They're all after the same one cleaning woman.
In 1985, the BBC adapted the novel as part of their first season of Miss Marple's stories. This was Joan Hickson's third appearance as the amateur detective.
Miss Marple! I think we called her Miss Hickson. I don't think we called her Joan. Or maybe you called her Joan after a while, but not till you were invited.
And I'd come here, pretend to be Julia, and keep peace in the camp.
No, it was completely awesome. I mean, the whole thing was awesome.
My parents split up 3 years after they were married. They split us up too.
For an English actor, it's a sort of rite of passage to be in an Agatha Christie. I feel very honoured to have been in them 3 times. And she just writes such glorious characters.
But a new era was approaching. As the 1960s began, a 70-year-old Agatha Christie found the world changing rapidly around her. And those changes were a huge influence on her next novel. a supernatural thriller populated by witches and poison. The dawn of the swinging 60s saw the publication of a very different type of Agatha Christie novel. This was a dark thriller, set against a backdrop of witchcraft in an English village and in fashionable London.
I think The Pale Horse has a different tone. The setting and the locations in the book are different. It's set in London, and it's set in 1960s London, and it's got a real feeling of modernity.
It's not a classic detective novel. And for a lot of her life, Christie had an interest in the supernatural. And this is the book where the supernatural meets murder mystery.
The Pale Horse is a Christie novel with no Marple and no Poirot. Instead, it tells the story of historian Mark Easterbrook, who gets drawn into a supernatural world in the strange village of Much Deeping.
Do you want your fortune told?
It starts out feeling like, the sort of atmosphere is so kind of spooky and ghostly, and there's all this, magic and supernatural illusions.
The village is full of unusual goings-on that Mark has to unravel. His name is on a list of people, most of whom have already been killed.
Do you know anyone on this list? Ormerod, Sanford, Hesketh, Dubois, Shaw, Tuckerton, Ardingly.
Mark becomes embroiled in trying to figure out what this list means, who these people are, what the connection is between these people.
The names on the list lead Mark Easterbrook to 3 witches.
They are somehow connected to this list, but we're not quite sure how.
What do you want?
I want you to set me free.
I played Teresa Gray, and she is one of the 3 witches. She's very good at sort of mind reading.
All we do is read cards and tea leaves.
What if that's all we can do?
The main kind of suspects are the witches because of their links to the supernatural, and that is something that naturally brings about a sense of fear in people.
The Pale Horse was first adapted for TV in 1996 and again in 2010. This second adaptation was markedly different from the novel, as it added Miss Marple, played by Julia Mackenzie, to the story. Then in 2019, screenwriter Sarah Phelps adapted the novel into a 2-part series. This adaptation also changed much of Christie's original plot.
I think it says something about the strength of Agatha Christie's novels, that something like Pale Horse has been adapted 3 times. Those adaptations are all very different from each other.
Sarah was actually, she took some liberties and made some changes. And I think it's kind of a fantastic example of how Christie stories can be adapted and work in different ways at different times.
But not all of Christie's fans agreed.
There's definitely a mixed response, and there's always going to be with things like this. That upsets a lot of people because that's what they've come to know, and that's what they've come to love. But there's also going to be a group of people who are huge fans who are excited to see what else can be pulled out of these classics.
I think there is an argument to be had that by taking her original stories and maybe making them more pertinent to a modern audience is a good thing.
London at the dawn of the swinging 60s features strongly in the novel. It was a world that Agatha was gradually coming to terms with.
And you can see the times that she's writing in, but you can also see how she's, how she's aging. And you can see her kind of tut-tutting in the background as young women are walking down the King's Road in short skirts and behaving in ways that I think she probably thought were pretty scandalous. And I think that's, that's a nice side of her that comes through.
Goodbye, Mark. Don't ever come here again.
By 1975, Agatha Christie had been a published author for 55 years. Hercule Poirot was still her most popular creation by far. But during the Second World War, Agatha was convinced that she wouldn't survive the bombing. She was so concerned that she had written Poirot's final case, entitled Curtain, and locked it away in a bank vault, to only be released after her death.
What actually happened in the mid-1970s was that it became clear that Agatha Christie, who was in her 80s by this point, was not going to be well enough to write another Hercule Poirot novel, and she wasn't particularly interested in doing it. And so her daughter, Rosalind, actually broached the subject and said, perhaps we want to think about publishing Curtain. And so, with her mother's permission, they dug out the typescript, and it was published at the end of 1975.
Curtain was to be Poirot's most surprising and controversial of cases. The murder is without a doubt the most shocking of Agatha's career.
It's quite difficult to talk about Curtain without giving away the ending. I mean, it famously is known that Poirot dies in Curtain.
It is a brilliant novel. It's not one of my personal favourites. I think that is purely because of Poirot dying. I'm not going to have a favourite Poirot novel in which Poirot dies, not on my watch.
Curtain is set where it all began, at the country house of Styles. But it's a Styles that has changed over the years.
Styles is no longer the lovely country house. It's being run as a kind of boarding house. It's a very sad place.
Someone to see you.
Poirot is convalescing at Styles, only he's old and frail.
In Curtain, Poirot is very much reduced as a character. He's in a wheelchair, he's shrunken, he's very, very old-seeming.
The very frail Poirot who we witness in this final adaptation is somebody that is a real sort of gut punch to those of us who've known him for nearly 25 years at this point.
Hastings. Oh, Hastings, my dear, dear Hastings. Poor old chap. Oh, mon ami, mon ami.
What Agatha does is she brings back Hastings, which is absolutely the right thing to do. Because Hastings in this book is a really good character.
And how are you? Me? I am a wreck, no, a ruin.
Hastings has been in Argentina with his wife, comes back from there a widower. And so you see the affection between the two and the respect.
The plot is loosely based on Shakespeare's Othello, where the character of Iago has a devilish knack of manipulating people to commit a murder.
Agatha Christie uses Shakespeare a great deal in her work. She's always referencing Shakespeare in one way or another, and this book, without giving anything away, references Othello in an extremely clever way.
Like Five Little Pigs, the various murders in Curtain all took place in the past, except one. And this is the most shocking.
Is a highly unusual one. I mean, it's a really interesting reason to kill somebody. You might even say a good reason to kill someone. And of course, that's bound in with the identity of the killer. And it comes, the book ends with a really extraordinary twist. You feel that Agatha Christie has managed to achieve every single twist that is possible in the course of her long career. But with Curtain, she finds a new one.
The poison works and must be stopped.
Curtain was also the very last episode of ITV's Poirot. It ran for an incredible 13 series and 70 episodes.
It was very moving to be part of, because partly because it was the end of a very long series, a very long commitment.
For actor David Suchet, this was the last in a long line of TV dramas.
How are you, old chap?
Playing the Belgian super sleuth.
Not dead yet.
I remember the last scenes that we played where I would be sitting at his bedside talking were very moving and quite difficult to do in actual fact, because it became quite emotional.
It was such an amazing achievement for David, and we were so happy for him to complete it. It was a bittersweet thing. It was sad.
In 1975, just after Curtain was published, the New York Times ran a front-page obituary for Poirot, the first one ever for a fictional character. On the 12th of January 1976, just 4 months after Curtain was published, Dame Agatha Christie died peacefully at home in Wallingford, in Oxfordshire. Her incredible career spanned 56 years, and so far she has sold over 2 billion books. She is the most successful novelist of all time.
I think the relationship between Agatha Christie and her audience is second to none, and it's one of the reasons why she has survived so well.
In ways of navigating our way through the 20th century, I think Agatha Christie is actually really important. She chronicles our lives with wit and murder in this very accessible way, but it's a real kind of chronicle of Englishness.
Christie's top priority is telling you a gripping and entertaining story.
I think she would have been amazed that we're talking about her 100 years on. She's not going to die out like the other Golden Age detective writers because she's simply better.
The more I learn about her, the more I read her, actually the more admiration I have, and actually then the more pride I have.
We continue to talk about her, we continue to make stuff about her, we continue to make her books, and I think we will do that, we will always do that.
Agatha Christie will continue to inspire those who read her books and watch her adaptations around the world. Her legacy will live on in countless versions of discerning crime fiction. Her enduring appeal has been resolute over a century, and undoubtedly the Queen of Crime will challenge and provoke us for at least another century to come.